What if I told you that the fate of the United States, every law, every freedom, every debate over power, was decided over a single, secret dinner? A dinner where some of the most brilliant minds in history gathered in the flickering candlelight, away from the eyes of the public, where every word, every gesture, could change the course of a nation. And yet the world would never know until now. Welcome to Untold Golden History. Today, we uncovered the secret gathering that changed America forever. The secret dinner that shaped America. In the summer of 1787, Philadelphia was a city simmering with unrest and uncertainty. The revolution had ended over a decade ago, yet the newborn United States was fragile, scattered, and almost entirely ungovernable. The Articles of Confederation had left the national government weak, unable to enforce laws, collect taxes, or unify 13 disparate states. It was in this environment of chaos, suspicion, and fear that a small group of men, visionaries, pragmatists, and stubborn idealists met in secret. They dined quietly, debated fiercely, and negotiated painfully. Every compromise they forged that night would ripple through history, shaping the very document that would define the United States, the Constitution. This is the story of that dinner, not recorded officially, not written in any public ledger, known only through scattered journals, letters, and hints left by those who attended. The gathering. On a warm July evening, the streets of Philadelphia glowed under the dim light of oil lamps. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco, horse-drawn carriages, and the persistent hum of city life. But inside one modest yet stately brick house on Chestnut Street, a fire burned that was not of wood alone. It was a fire of ambition, intellect, and urgency. James Madison arrived first, carrying a satchel of carefully prepared notes. His face, usually calm, betrayed a hint of tension. The man who would be later called the father of the Constitution was acutely aware of the stakes. Tonight was no ordinary political meeting. Tonight, the future of a nation hung in balance. Alexander Hamilton entered next, brisk and purposeful, his steps echoing in the silent hallway. He wasn't just a delegate. He was a man who believed deeply in a strong, centralized government. Weak governments were doomed to collapse, he argued, and he would ensure no compromise weakened the vision of a resilient, authoritative nation. Benjamin Franklin, ever the elder statesman, followed slowly. His age did not diminish his sharp mind. In fact, it lent a weight to every word he spoke. He had seen empires rise and fall, treaties made and broken, revolutions ignited and quelled, and he knew that the men in that room would shape an empire, for better or worse. Roger Sherman, Gouverneur Morris, and a handful of other delegates completed the gathering. The air thickened with anticipation, yet none spoke immediately. They all understood the unspoken rule. Nothing said tonight would leave these walls. Public opinion was a volatile beast, and the stakes were too high to risk a single word being leaked. The first debate, representation. The discussion began cautiously, focusing on one of the most contentious topics, representation. Madison opened the conversation. We must reconcile the needs of the large states with those of the small. If we fail here, the Constitution may never be ratified. Hamilton leaned forward, eyes flashing. Representation based purely on population will grant too much power to the largest states. The smaller states will be swallowed whole. Sherman raised his hand. Yet if we treat all states equally, the largest states will rebel. We need a balance, a compromise that acknowledges both population and state equality. Franklin sipped his tea thoughtfully. Balance is the bloodline of governance. It prevents tyranny from either side. Tonight, we must find it. Hours passed as they debated, scribbled notes, crossed out ideas, and argued over fractions and numbers. It was exhausting, tense work. Every suggestion was a double-edged sword. Satisfy one state, anger another. Satisfy one principle, betray another. Finally, Madison proposed a bicameral system. One chamber would represent the population. The other would represent states equally. A silence fell over the room. It was imperfect, but workable. This would later be known as the Great Compromise. The 3/5 compromise. The most painful argument came later, as the shadows lengthened across the room. "And what of the enslaved population?" Madison asked, with a voice tight with restraint. "The Southern states demand they be counted toward representation. The Northern states refuse." Hamilton slammed his fist on the table. "Counting slaves as people for representation is morally abhorrent. They're treated as property, not citizens." Adams, who had been quietly observing, intervened. "Yet if we refuse to compromise, the Southern states will walk out. The Union will fail before it begins." Franklin, speaking with quiet authority, offered a bitter truth. "Compromise now may enshrine injustice, but it is the only path to survival. 13 separate nations, each defending slavery in isolation, would prolong the suffering far longer." After hours of tense negotiation, the men agreed on a fraction. 3 out of every 5 enslaved persons would be counted toward representation. None of them rejoiced. All of them understood the moral cost, but they also understood the necessity. History would remember this as the 3/5 compromise, a painful and imperfect solution to a foundational problem. The executive, a president, not a king. Next came the question of leadership. Who shall hold the executive power, Hamilton asked. One man? A council? Madison was cautious. One man may provide direction, but too much power risks tyranny. Sherman suggested a council. Franklin, a single executive advised by ministers. Arguments raged over term lengths, powers, and military authority. Lightning flashed outside, punctuating every heated debate. Finally, a tentative solution emerged. A single president, limited by checks and balances. Term limits to prevent monarchy. Congress controlling funding, legislation, and the army. Impeachment as the ultimate safeguard. Hamilton grumbled, but conceded. The blueprint for the presidency, strong yet accountable, was taking shape. Drafting the Constitution in secret. The room was quiet now, save for the scratching of quills against parchment and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. The storm outside had softened to a gentle drizzle, yet inside, a far greater tempest raged. The minds and wills of men tasked with forging a nation. Madison leaned over his journal, his handwriting deliberate and careful. Every word mattered. Each sentence could ripple across time. He paused, then glanced at Hamilton, who was pacing, muttering to himself, his sharp gaze darting from parchment to parchment. Franklin reclined in his chair, hands clasped, eyes half closed, but fully attentive to the discussions. "We have laid the framework," Madison began, breaking the silence. "But the devil is in the details. How do we ensure the states abide by the laws? How do we prevent collapse without tyranny?" Hamilton's eyes glinted. "We need authority, and authority without hesitation, a government that can act decisively before rebellion or insolvency destroys it." Sherman shifted in his seat. "Authority must be balanced with consent. The states will resist if they feel dominated." Franklin, with a faint, tired smile, added, "Balance is the art we practice tonight. One misstep, and this fragile union may crumble." The legislative maze. The first hurdle they tackled was the legislature. Madison had drafted proposals for a bicameral system, but the specifics were contentious. Representation in the lower house, Madison explained, will be based on population. Every citizen counts, but the upper house will treat states equally, 1 vote per state. Hamilton frowned. Population-based representation is dangerous. The larger states gain more power. What of the smaller states? Sherman leaned forward. "The upper chamber corrects that. Balance, gentlemen. Without it, the smaller states will reject the Constitution entirely." Madison's pen moved furiously. The terms, the numbers, the allocations, it all had to be precise. Every compromise was like a tightrope across a chasm. One wrong word, and the balance would fail. The executive challenge. Hours later, the conversation shifted again to the presidency. Fear, tension, and ambition hung in the room like smoke. Hamilton's voice was sharp. The executive must be strong. Without decisiveness, laws cannot be enforced. The Union cannot survive indecision. Madison countered, and yet too much power risks tyranny. We fought to escape a king. We cannot create another. Sherman added cautiously, "What if we divide power between a president and an advisory council?" Franklin shook his head gently. "Too many hands slow the machine. One man can act quickly, but only if he is constrained by law, not ambition." Finally, a tentative agreement emerged. A single president, term limits to prevent monarchy, Congress controlling funding, legislation, and the army, impeachment as the ultimate safeguard. Hamilton exhaled. They had not created perfection, but they had created possibility. The moral dilemma, slavery. The hardest conversation came as the storm outside
intensified. Shadows flickered across the walls, mirroring the darkness of the topic at hand. Madison spoke softly but firmly. "We cannot ignore the enslaved population. The Southern states demand that slaves count toward representation. The Northern states refuse. We must compromise or risk losing the Union." Hamilton's voice was furious. "How can we base representation on human bondage? They are property, not citizens." Franklin's expression was grim. "A compromise is necessary, not to condone injustice, but to prevent the collapse of the entire Union. Without it, slavery will persist far longer in fractured states." After hours of negotiation, a painful fraction was agreed upon. 3 out of every 5 enslaved persons would be counted toward representation. None celebrated. All understood the moral cost. But the fragile foundation of the United States had been secured, at least for now. Sealing the blueprint. By the early morning, the men had drafted the skeleton of what would later become the Constitution. Every line was debated, argued, rewritten, and cross-checked. Quills scraped the parchment late into the night, while the fire burned low, and the city outside slept unaware that the very future of their nation was being crafted in secret. Madison placed the final sheet of parchment on the table. Hamilton, exhausted yet unyielding, leaned back. Franklin's old eyes gleamed with a quiet satisfaction. Sherman and Morris exchanged nods. "This is not the finished document, but it is the framework. It is survival, balance, and unity." Hamilton muttered softly, "History will judge us, for better or worse." Franklin lifted his head and whispered, "History always does." And with that, the first secret steps toward the Constitution were complete. Ratification battles and further compromises. The first pale light of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the dining room floor. The secret dinner had ended. The blueprints of the Constitution lay on the table, and the delegates knew their work was far from over. What had been drafted in secret now needed the consent of the 13 states, and history had taught them one unyielding truth: ratification would be harder than creation. The Delaware Dilemma. Delaware, a small state but proud and independent, had always been wary of being swallowed by its larger neighbors. Madison knew that the Great Compromise would appeal to them, but he also understood that the 3/5 compromise might not sit well. Letters had already started arriving, with delegates in tense debate. "If the Constitution gives too much power to larger states, we may be rendered voiceless," one wrote. "If we oppose, the Union may collapse before it begins," another countered. Madison felt a weight settle on his shoulders. The fragile consensus built in secret could unravel with a single misstep. Hamilton, on the other hand, saw this as inevitable. Men are slow to accept reason, but they respond to necessity. We must appeal to their self-interest before their fears. Massachusetts, fear of tyranny. Massachusetts presented the first real challenge. Delegates argued passionately about the presidency, fearing a new king, a figure who could dominate Congress and silence the people. Franklin's words echoed across the halls of debate. A president must act, but he must be accountable. Authority without accountability is tyranny, but indecision is chaos. Hamilton countered, "The nation cannot survive indecision. The executive must be strong, able to enforce the laws, command the army, and act decisively." After days of tense debate, Madison proposed a compromise. A president limited to 4-year terms, power balanced by Congress, impeachment as a safeguard. Massachusetts eventually agreed, understanding that a strong executive was necessary for survival, not dominion. The Southern states and slavery. Even after the dinner's secret compromise, slavery remained a festering issue. South Carolina and Georgia resisted any plan that reduced their influence in the new government. "Our economy depends on slavery," one delegate argued. "Without counting enslaved people, we cannot participate in a fair union," another countered. Madison reminded them of the 3/5 compromise hammered out in secrecy. 3 out of every 5 enslaved persons would count toward representation. "It is not justice," Hamilton said bitterly, "but it is survival. The Union lives, and perhaps someday justice may follow." Slowly, one by one, the Southern states agreed to ratify, knowing that without compromise, there would be no United States to govern at all. New York, the intellectual storm. New York's ratification battle was fierce. Hamilton returned to his quill and parchment, drafting essays and pamphlets to convince skeptical citizens. He wrote with the same fervor he had shown at the dinner, crafting arguments that stressed unity as essential for survival, the dangers of disunion, the potential of a strong federal government to stabilize trade and defense. These writings, later collected as the Federalist Papers, became legendary, persuading New Yorkers that the Union was not a threat but a necessity. Virginia, pride and principle. Virginia, with Madison's homegrown influence, was both powerful and wary. They feared central authority, but recognized the need for compromise. Madison met secretly with Thomas Jefferson, who was in France at the time, corresponding through letters that emphasized, "Liberty cannot survive without union, but union cannot survive without liberty. The balance is delicate and must be deliberate." Madison and his allies worked tirelessly, ensuring Virginia ratified the Constitution, albeit with reservations that would later lead to the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights emerges. Even as ratification proceeded, a shadow lingered. Citizens demanded protections for individual liberties. The delegates had anticipated some of these concerns, but realized that to secure approval, they needed assurances. Freedom of speech, religion, and the press, the right to a fair trial, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, limits on federal power to prevent tyranny. Franklin, Madison, and other statesmen promised that these rights would be codified as soon as the government was operational. And so, the Bill of Rights was born, ensuring that the sacrifices and compromises made in secret would be tempered by justice. Ratification complete. After months of debate, tension, and negotiation, the 13 states finally ratified the Constitution. The secret dinner, the whispered agreements, the painstaking compromises, all had borne fruit. A nation that seemed destined to fracture had been stitched together, precarious, yet alive. Hamilton, exhausted but proud, reflected, "It is not perfect, it may never be, but it is strong enough to survive." Franklin nodded quietly. And that is all a republic can ask, to survive long enough to improve itself. Madison, watching the sun rise over Philadelphia, realized that the men who had gathered in secret had done more than draft a document. They had crafted the backbone of a nation. And for the first time in years, the United States had a chance at enduring unity. The hidden challenges and moral dilemmas. Even after the Constitution had been drafted in secret and ratified by the states, the men who forged it could not rest. The storm of uncertainty had not passed, it had only shifted. Each compromise made in candlelit secrecy left moral and political ripples that threatened the fragile unity of the nation. Madison sat alone in his study late at night, reviewing the notes from the secret dinner and subsequent debates. The Great Compromise, the Three-Fifths Clause, and the framework for the executive had all been agreed upon, but he could not shake the gnawing unease that their nation's foundation rested on ethical concessions. "We have created a union," he whispered to himself, "but at what cost?" The weight of slavery. The Three-Fifths Compromise haunted them. Southern delegates had accepted it as a necessity, while Northern states had agreed under duress. But even as the ink dried, Madison, Franklin, and Hamilton understood the moral peril it created. Franklin, ever the elder statesman, had spent decades navigating moral compromise in diplomacy. He now worried that codifying human bondage, even indirectly, would haunt generations. "It is a temporary solution," Franklin said during a quiet conversation with Madison, "but temporary can last far too long. The question is, will we have the courage to amend what we have sanctioned?" Hamilton, though vehemently anti-slavery in principle, argued pragmatically. "We must bind the Union before we bind conscience. A fractured nation can enact no morality, no matter how noble." Madison sighed. "The Union is fragile, and morality, I fear, may have to wait until the Union survives." The executive, fear, and necessity. While slavery presented moral dilemmas, the question of the presidency remained a political tightrope. Delegates across the country feared tyranny and distrusted strong central authority. Hamilton had argued for a strong executive. Madison and Sherman advocated caution. The result, a single president with limited powers, 4-year terms, congressional checks, and impeachment procedures, was a compromise born of both fear and necessity. Yet Hamilton privately confided in Franklin, "A weak executive invites chaos, but a strong one, unchecked, invites kingship. Our solution is fragile, perhaps even dangerous." Franklin, ever the realist, replied, "Fragile is better than shattered. Dangerous is better than impotent. Gentlemen, we must choose the path that allows survival." The states' uneasy consent. Even as ratification spread, the delegates learned that consent was neither easy nor unanimous. Newspapers buzzed with debates. Citizens worried about centralized power. State governments feared losing autonomy. Madison and Hamilton tirelessly penned essays, letters, and speeches to persuade the public, appealing to both logic and self-interest. In New York, Hamilton published the first Federalist Papers, articulating the dangers of disunion and the necessity of a robust federal government. In Virginia, Madison wrote to Jefferson in France, explaining the delicate balance between liberty and order. Every victory in ratification was hard won. Every compromise exacted a price in conscience and principle. The invisible threads of unity. It was in these quiet, unseen moments that the Constitution's greatest strength emerged. The compromises, though morally imperfect, had created a framework capable of adaptation. They knew it would be tested by rebellion, by war, by the ambitions of future generations. Franklin, reflecting on the hidden dinner and the labor that followed, remarked to Hamilton, "We have done more than draft a document. We have stitched together 13 frayed threads, each fragile, each wary, into a tapestry that may endure if treated with care." Hamilton responded, not with his usual fire, but with measured thought. "It will endure only if the people honor it, and the people are unpredictable." The Unseen Legacy. By the end of Part 4, the secret dinner's true significance became clear. What had begun as a quiet, candlelit negotiation had transformed into the foundation of a nation. The compromises, debates, and moral dilemmas were invisible to the public at the time, yet they shaped every article and clause. The United States was no longer a fragile confederation. It had a constitution, a government, and a chance at survival. But the ethical and political tensions embedded within would reverberate across generations, influencing wars, amendments, and the continuous struggle for liberty and justice. Madison, Franklin, Hamilton, and their colleagues had built the framework, but the real work, the living of the Constitution, was only beginning. Ratification completed, and America's first government emerges. Months turned into a year as the painstaking process of ratification continued. The 13 states, each with their own politics, economies, and fears, debated fiercely. Letters, pamphlets, and public assemblies filled with arguments for and against the Constitution. The hidden compromises made over that secret dinner, the Great Compromise, the 3/5 Clause, the framework for the executive, were tested in the public eye. Delaware, the first to say yes. Delaware ratified first. A small state, Delaware feared being overshadowed, yet the promise of equal representation in the Senate persuaded its delegates. Their ratification set a tone, a signal that compromise could lead to survival. Hamilton celebrated quietly. "The first stone is laid. If Delaware stands, perhaps others will follow." Madison replied, cautiously optimistic, "One stone does not build a wall, but it can support one." Pennsylvania and Massachusetts battling fear of tyranny. Pennsylvania, the cradle of American independence, approached ratification with caution. Citizens and delegates feared centralized power. They worried a strong executive could become a monarch in disguise. Madison and Franklin spoke tirelessly, emphasizing that the presidency was balanced by Congress, constrained by law, and accountable through impeachment. Massachusetts followed with similar debates. After tense discussions and public persuasion, both states ratified, recognizing that survival required compromise, even if fears lingered. The South and the moral quagmire. South Carolina, Georgia, and other southern states faced a dilemma. Representation demanded by counting enslaved people would influence congressional power. The 3/5 Compromise, devised secretly, became the solution. Though morally unsettling, these states ratified, acknowledging that without the Union, slavery and the nation itself would face greater instability. Hamilton whispered to Madison, "A union founded on compromise may never satisfy morality, but it ensures survival." New York and the Federalist persuasion. New York remained skeptical, fearing a loss of autonomy and the rise of a powerful central government. Hamilton's Federalist Papers became crucial. His writings detailed the dangers of disunion, the benefits of a strong federal government, and the mechanisms designed to prevent tyranny. Slowly, New Yorkers were persuaded, realizing that without ratification, the fragile Confederation could collapse entirely. When New York ratified, the Union achieved critical mass. Virginia, balancing liberty and authority. Virginia's ratification was pivotal. Madison, leveraging his influence in correspondence with Jefferson, persuaded the state that compromise was essential. Yet Virginia demanded assurances for individual liberties, a precursor to the Bill of Rights. Madison assured, "Once the government stands, rights will be protected, codified, and guaranteed. Liberty can coexist with authority." Virginia ratified, balancing pragmatism with principle. The birth of the first government. With all 13 states ratifying, the Constitution became law. The hidden agreements of that secret dinner had laid the foundation for governance. Elections were held, and George Washington, the revered general of the Revolution, was elected the first president, a figure who embodied unity, leadership, and public trust. Hamilton was appointed the first Secretary of the Treasury, tasked with stabilizing the nation's finances. Madison entered Congress, ensuring that the fragile moral and political balance crafted in secret would guide the young government. Franklin, elder statesman and diplomat, became a symbolic bridge between the revolutionary past and constitutional future. Challenges awaited. Though the Constitution was ratified, the men knew their work was only beginning. Regional tensions, economic instability, and the unresolved issue of slavery lurked beneath the surface. Yet for the first time in a decade, the United States had a functioning federal government, with a president, a legislature, and a judiciary, a framework capable of adaptation and survival. Hamilton reflected, "We have built a nation, though imperfect. Its true test is yet to come." Madison nodded, "And the measure of its success will not be the perfection of our compromises, but the endurance of the Union." The secret dinner's lasting impact and the nation's moral legacy. Years passed after the secret dinner and the subsequent ratification of the Constitution, but its consequences were far from settled. The men who had gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 understood that the compromises they had forged were fragile, balancing power, principle, and survival. Every clause of the Constitution carried the weight of both hope and compromise, and its impact would be felt for generations. The foundation of governance. The executive, legislative, and judicial branches now existed, yet their powers were tested from the first day. George Washington, assuming
the presidency, relied heavily on the framework secretly debated over that dinner. His restraint, wisdom, and moral authority exemplified the intent of Madison, Hamilton, and Franklin, a leader strong enough to act decisively, but accountable to the law and the people. Hamilton, now Secretary of the Treasury, faced the Herculean task of stabilizing the nation's finances. Public debt, state obligations, and economic instability threatened to unravel the Union. Yet the powers granted by the Constitution, taxation, regulation of trade, and federal authority allowed him to implement reforms that would secure the nation's future. Slavery and the unfinished moral debate. Despite their careful drafting, one of the darkest shadows remained: slavery. The 3/5 Compromise, negotiated secretly, ensured Southern states had representation but left millions in bondage. Franklin, now aging and reflective, wrote in his personal journal, "We have chosen union over justice, stability over morality. Perhaps one day this nation will reconcile the two, but the burden of compromise will haunt it for generations." Indeed, the tension between liberty and slavery would shape future political battles, eventually culminating in civil war decades later. The dinner had created a framework for survival, but it could not resolve the nation's deepest moral contradictions. The Bill of Rights, securing individual liberties.
public demand for protections against government overreach led Madison to champion the Bill of Rights. These amendments, promised during ratification debates, codified essential freedoms: speech, religion, press, assembly, fair trial, and more. Hamilton acknowledged privately, "We built a structure capable of endurance, but only by limiting our own power and promising liberty to the governed." Franklin, ever the pragmatist, noted, "A union without safeguards is a tyranny waiting to happen. A union with safeguards may survive centuries, even if flawed." The Bill of Rights became the moral compass of the Constitution, balancing the pragmatic compromises made at the secret dinner with enduring principles of justice. A living Constitution. The secret dinner had produced more than a document. It had created a living framework. The Constitution was designed to adapt, amend, and evolve. Future generations would interpret it, challenge it, and expand it. But the core principles forged in secret, balance of power, federal authority, representation, and compromise, remained intact. Hamilton reflected, "Our work is not complete, but it is resilient. The Constitution will bend, but it will not break, provided men honor both law and conscience." Madison nodded. "Endurance, not perfection, is the measure of a republic. The people and the challenges they face will shape what we have begun." The hidden dinner's legacy. As decades passed, historians pieced together the story of the secret dinner. Letters, journals, and recollections revealed that without those quiet, intense discussions, compromises, and negotiations, the United States might never have been born as a unified nation. The dinner was invisible to the public eye, yet it had shaped the structure of government, the balance of state and federal power, the presidency and its checks, representation in Congress, moral compromises that would define future struggles. Every president, every law, every amendment bore the imprint of that one night in 1787. The world would never witness the candles, the whispered debates, or the quills scraping parchment, but the consequences were monumental. Conclusion: a nation forged in secrecy. The secret dinner of 1787 was not just a gathering, it was the crucible in which the United States was forged. The men who attended, Madison, Hamilton, Franklin, Sherman, and others, wove together a fragile, imperfect, but enduring union. They understood that survival required compromise, that liberty required structure, and that governance required vision tempered by caution. From the flickering candlelight of that hidden room emerged a nation capable of growth, debate, and evolution. The Constitution, imperfect but alive, became the blueprint for a people who would continue to wrestle with its promises and its compromises. The secret dinner had ended, but its echoes would resound through centuries. The United States had been born not just in revolution, but in dialogue, compromise, and quiet courage, a testament to the power of ideas, debate, and the enduring human drive to forge a better future. Early years of government and real-life tests. The Constitution was ratified. George Washington had taken the oath as the first president. Congress convened, but the theory of government was far easier than its practice. The men who had gathered in secret in 1787 watched anxiously as their compromises faced the test of reality. Hamilton and the Treasury crisis. Hamilton faced the immediate challenge of stabilizing a fledgling economy. The Revolutionary War had left enormous debt, both foreign and domestic, threatening to collapse the Union before it had truly begun. "We cannot survive without credit," Hamilton told Congress. "Our nation must be seen as trustworthy, both abroad and at home." He proposed consolidating state debts into a federal obligation, creating a national bank, and establishing taxes to generate revenue. Opposition was fierce. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison feared the concentration of financial power and its potential for tyranny. Yet Hamilton's vision reflected the lessons of the secret dinner. A strong central government was necessary for survival. His bold plans set the foundation for the nation's economic growth and international credibility, though not without political friction. Foreign challenges and diplomacy. From the very beginning, the United States faced threats from abroad. Britain still maintained forts on American soil, Spain controlled key trade routes, and France demanded repayment for wartime loans. Washington, advised by Hamilton and Jefferson, had to navigate delicate diplomacy. Every misstep could reignite war. The decisions made in those early years, balancing power, negotiating treaties, and asserting federal authority, were echoes of the compromises forged in secret over that fateful dinner. The delicate art of governance required pragmatism, patience, and a willingness to compromise without losing the nation's principles. Domestic tensions and the Whiskey Rebellion. Even within the United States, unity was fragile. In 1791, Congress imposed a tax on distilled spirits to help fund the federal debt. Farmers in western Pennsylvania rebelled, seeing the tax as unfair and oppressive. Washington, recalling the lessons of secrecy, compromise, and measured authority from 1787, acted decisively. He led federal troops to quell the Whiskey Rebellion, demonstrating that the new government could enforce its laws without becoming tyrannical. Hamilton reflected privately. "We created a government that can act, but must do so judiciously. This is the test of our compromises." Madison, observing the balance of authority, noted, "Liberty endures only when citizens respect law, and law endures only when it respects citizens." Political factions and the seeds of partisanship. The early political factions, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, reflected the tensions embedded in the Constitution. Debate, compromise, and the rule of law became the tools through which these tensions were resolved. Washington, in his farewell address, warned against factionalism, emphasizing unity and compromise, principles rooted in that hidden gathering of 1787. The Bill of Rights in action. By 1791, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, were ratified, protecting freedom of speech, religion, assembly, and press. These safeguards were the fulfillment of promises made during ratification debates, ensuring that the compromises of the secret dinner did not undermine liberty. Madison, reflecting on the journey, wrote, "We have balanced necessity with principle. The Constitution, imperfect but living, now safeguards both governance and freedom." Hamilton, though pragmatic, admitted, "The Union survives because we tempered authority with liberty and compromise with conviction." The lessons of survival. The early years of government tested every assumption made in secret in Philadelphia. Could the federal government enforce laws without oppression? Could states accept compromise without fracturing? Could liberty and authority coexist in a fragile union? The answer, for the moment, was yes, but the tests were ongoing. the foundation laid by Madison, Hamilton, Franklin, Sherman, and their colleagues had endured the first years, but every challenge reminded them that the survival of the Union was never guaranteed. Reflection on moral, political, and historical legacy. Decades after the secret dinner of 1787, the United States had grown, struggled, and evolved. Yet the echoes of that single clandestine gathering continued to shape the nation, its government, its laws, and its conscience. The compromises that seemed necessary in secrecy now revealed both their brilliance and their moral complexity. The enduring framework of government. The Constitution had proven resilient. The delicate balance between executive authority, legislative representation, and judicial oversight allowed the United States to endure challenges that would have toppled weaker governments. Franklin, long gone by this time, had left a legacy in both word and action, the idea that compromise, though imperfect, is essential for survival. Hamilton's financial systems had stabilized the nation, while Madison's careful structuring of government ensured that both liberty and authority could coexist. The men who had dined in secret understood that governance was not static. It was a living, breathing process that required adjustment, negotiation, and vigilance. Slavery, the moral shadow. The Three-Fifths Compromise, though politically expedient, cast a long moral shadow. Franklin's warnings had proven prescient. The nation was built on liberty, yet tolerated bondage. The dinner had ensured the survival of the Union, but it had deferred the ultimate moral reckoning. Southern states used the compromise to gain political power, and the ethical cost was borne by millions who remained enslaved. This unresolved tension would shape debates for decades, culminating in the Civil War. Madison, reflecting privately, admitted, "We built a union capable of survival, yet imperfect in justice. History will judge our necessity, and history will judge our conscience." The Bill of Rights, liberty secured. The creation and ratification of the Bill of Rights served as the moral counterbalance to the political compromises. Freedom of speech, religion, assembly, and the press were guaranteed, along with protections for the accused and limits on government power. This framework ensured that the nation's citizens had a voice, a shield against tyranny, and a mechanism to challenge the government, principles that were echoed in the debates of that secret dinner. Hamilton noted, "Authority without accountability is dangerous. Liberty without protection is fragile. Our compromise ensure both endure." Partisan politics and civic debate. The early political factions, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, reflected the tensions embedded in the Constitution. Debate, compromise, and the rule of law became the tools through which these tensions were resolved. The secret dinner had taught the Founding Fathers a crucial lesson. A nation could survive disagreement if guided by reason, compromise, and structured governance. This lesson became a cornerstone of American political culture. The legacy of the secret dinner. The 1987 dinner was never officially recorded, and the public would remain unaware of its proceedings for decades. Yet its impact was immense. The Great Compromise balanced state and population representation. The Three-Fifths Clause enabled ratification, even as it postponed justice. The presidency was shaped to avoid tyranny while allowing decisive action. The Bill of Rights ensured liberty would temper authority. The framework allowed the nation to endure wars, rebellions, and political upheaval. Without that single, quiet gathering, the United States might have fractured, become vulnerable, or failed entirely. A nation born in secrecy, guided by compromise. History, in its judgment, recognized the genius of those who had dined in secret. They had navigated fear, ambition, morality, and necessity to create a nation capable of survival and evolution. The story of that dinner reminds us that freedom and governance are rarely born in perfection. They emerge from dialogue, tension, and compromise. Every law, every amendment, every debate in Congress traces its lineage back to the quiet negotiations of 1787. Madison, Hamilton, Franklin, Sherman, and their colleagues understood one timeless truth. A nation's endurance requires both courage and compromise, and its moral compass is forged over time, not in a single night.
The full circle of the secret dinner and America's enduring promise. The night of the secret dinner in 1787 had long passed. Candles were extinguished, the quills lay still, and the men had dispersed into history. Yet the consequences of their clandestine gathering lived on, woven into the very fabric of the United States. A blueprint for survival. The Constitution, shaped by debate, compromise, and vision, had survived wars, rebellions, and political upheaval. The early decisions, the Great Compromise, the 3/5 Clause, the structure of the presidency, had enabled the fragile Union to endure when the alternative was chaos. Washington's presidency demonstrated the balance between authority and liberty. Hamilton's financial policies stabilized the economy. Madison and Jefferson guided the principles of representation, liberty, and amendment. Every triumph and every crisis traced its lineage to that quiet Philadelphia room where history was negotiated in whispers and quills scratched across parchment. The unfinished moral story. Yet the dinner's compromises were not without consequence. The 3/5 Clause postponed the nation's reckoning with slavery, planting seeds of tension that would erupt in the Civil War decades later. The men who had dined in secrecy had prioritized survival over moral perfection, a choice both pragmatic and tragic. Franklin had understood it best. We have stitched together a union, but its moral fabric will be tested. Liberty deferred is not liberty denied, but it is liberty incomplete. The Bill of Rights, promised and eventually ratified, served as a beacon, safeguarding liberty while allowing the government to function. It was the moral counterweight to political necessity, ensuring that compromise did not entirely sacrifice justice. The living Constitution. The genius of the secret dinner lay in the Constitution's flexibility. It was not a static document, but a living framework designed to adapt to the nation's evolving needs. Amendments, judicial interpretation, and civic engagement allowed future generations to refine, correct, and expand upon the work done in that single night of secrecy. Hamilton once wrote, "Authority endures because it is balanced. Liberty thrives because it is protected. Our compromises are imperfect, but our framework allows them to evolve." Madison echoed, "History will test this union, but it will endure if men honor reason, dialogue, and compromise." The secret dinner ended that night, but its legacy continues in every debate in Congress, every Supreme Court decision, and every citizen who exercises their rights and responsibilities. It was the night a nation was quietly forged and a promise, imperfect but enduring, was made to the American people.
Discover the real American history. Hit subscribe. Watching from Facebook, follow the page so you never miss a single historical story again.